The shriek of steel on steel was the first warning. Emily Carter jolted from a light doze, felt the train car lurch violently, throwing her against the hard wooden seat. Outside the grimy window, the landscape of cracked red earth and skeletal mesas had dissolved into a blur. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels gave way to a screeching metallic groan that clawed at the nerves. Passengers cried out in alarm, clutching their seats and each other as the train ground to a shuddering halt in a cloud of its own steam and dust. Silence descended thick and unnatural, broken only by a crying baby and the nervous whisper of the wind through the canyons. Emily straightened her bonnet, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. They were miles from any station, adrift in an ocean of sun-scorched wilderness. Then came the sound of galloping horses. Heads turned toward the windows. A dozen riders, their faces obscured by dirty bandanas, swarmed the train like vultures circling a carcass. They moved with a brutal efficiency that spoke of long practice. Gunshots cracked the air, not aimed to kill, but to command. "Stay in your seats. Nobody moves," a voice roared from outside. The door to Emily's carriage burst open. A man filled the doorway, broad and menacing, a Colt peacemaker held steady in his hand. His eyes, cold and dark above the faded red cloth, scanned the terrified faces inside. Behind him, other men were uncoupling the mail car, their shouts muffled by the wind. "We ain't here for your trinkets," the masked man growled, his voice a low rasp. "We want the strongbox from the front. You stay quiet, you stay alive." Most passengers froze, eyes wide with fear. A portly businessman in the seat across from Emily fumbled with his wallet, his hands trembling. The rider ignored him, his gaze sweeping the car, a predator assessing its territory. As his eyes passed over Emily, they snagged on the glint of silver at her throat. It was her mother's locket. A simple oval piece worn smooth with time, it held tiny portraits of her parents. It was the only thing of true value she owned, a tangible link to a life and a love she had left behind forever. She had worn it for luck, for courage, for the journey to meet Henry. The rider took a step toward her. Emily's hand flew to her neck, a reflexive, protective gesture. His eyes narrowed. He was not here for trinkets, he had said, but opportunity was a fickle creature in this land. "Nice," he grunted, closing the distance between them. The air filled with the scent of trail dust, sweat, and cheap whiskey. "Please," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. It was my mother's. For a moment he hesitated, his gaze fixed on her face. He saw not just fear, but a flicker of defiance in her clear blue eyes, a strength she didn't know she possessed. But sentiment was a luxury he could not afford. With a swift, brutal motion, he reached out. His gloved fingers were rough against her skin. He tore the locket from her neck. The delicate chain snapped, stinging her skin. She gasped a sharp intake of breath that was more pain than fear. He held the locket in his palm for a second, its silver gleam mocking her in the dusty light, before shoving it deep into his coat pocket. He gave her one last dismissive look, and then turned, bellowing at the other passengers to keep their heads down. Outside, a sharp whistle pierced the air. The job was done. The riders retreated as quickly as they had come, their horses kicking up plumes of red dust as they disappeared back into the unforgiving landscape. The strongbox, containing the payroll for half the ranchers in the territory, and the assets of the Dawson's Crossing Bank, was gone. The train remained still for a long time, the passengers wrapped in a stunned, violated silence. The conductor, his face pale, eventually made his way through the cars, his voice shaky as he tried to offer reassurance. But Emily heard nothing. Her hand was pressed to the hollow of her throat where the locket had rested for years. She had arrived in the West, not just with a broken promise waiting for her, but with a piece of her soul torn away. She was no longer just a hopeful bride-to-be stepping into a new life. She was a victim of this lawless, brutal land. A quiet fury began to smolder beneath her shock and grief, a tiny, hard ember of resolve. She would find the man who did this. She would get her locket back. An hour later, the train limped into Dawson's Crossing. The noon sun beat down on the dusty platform, a remote rail stop that felt like the edge of the world. The steam train hissed its final weary breath. Emily Carter stepped down from the carriage in her faded cream dress, the fabric no longer holding the promise of a wedding gown, but serving as a fragile armor against the harsh reality that had just assaulted her. She carried her small satchel, a leather-bound Bible, and the letter from Henry now folded so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked around. Men in dust-stained boots loaded crates, their faces grim, as news of the robbery spread. A woman with 2 children was quickly swept into waiting arms. But for Emily, there was no one. The platform was a sea of strangers, their faces a mixture of concern for the stolen payroll and a casual indifference to her solitary figure. She stood there, dust clinging to her hem, the wind tugging at her hat. Her throat was tight, her eyes burning, not with unshed tears of disappointment, but with the cold fire of violation. The empty space on the platform where Henry should have been was now just one more loss in a day, defined by it. She was alone, robbed, and stepping into a future that was a complete and terrifying unknown. Her disappointment had been eclipsed by a stark, dangerous clarity. This land had taken something from her, and she would not let it go unanswered. The sun hung low, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, as Emily followed the small barefoot girl down a dirt road flanked by whispering grass and crooked fence posts. The girl's name was Clara, and she walked with a solemn purpose, her tiny hand clutching Emily's as if she were a lifeline. Emily's satchel felt heavier with each step, her earlier resolve now tempered by a deep, weary uncertainty. She was chasing the ghost of a man she barely knew into the heart of a life that was not meant for her. They reached a modest homestead nestled in a shallow valley. A weathered barn stood sentinel over a sagging corral, and smoke curled faintly from the crooked stone chimney of a small, sturdy house. The place looked tired, but it was not derelict. It was tended to, cared for by a hand that knew duty even when hope was gone. "This is home," Clara announced softly. Before Emily could find a reply, the screen door of the house creaked open. A man stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his frame hardened by labor, not bulk. He might have been 35, but the sun and sorrow had carved deeper lines into his face. His dark hair was unruly, and his eyes, the same deep hazel as his daughter's, had seen too much and said too little. He carried himself like a man accustomed to silence, worn down by it, until it had become a part of his very bones. "Clara," he said. His voice was a low baritone, rough but not unkind. "Papa," she replied, her face lighting up. "The angel came, just like Mama said." The man's eyes flicked from his daughter to Emily, his brow furrowing in a mixture of confusion and exhaustion. Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was it. The moment of reckoning. She stepped forward, her boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt of the yard. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Emily Carter. She trailed off. She could see it in his face already, the complete lack of recognition. The hope she hadn't even realized she was still clinging to finally withered and died. "You don't know who I am," she stated, the words tasting of ash. The man shook his head slowly, his gaze cautious. "No, ma'am. I can't say that I do." Clara looked between them, her small face clouded with confusion. "She came off the train, Papa. She has a dress like cream, and she looks like someone from the sky." Emily's fingers trembled as she reached into her satchel and pulled out the worn letter. She held it out to him, a fragile piece of paper that contained the entirety of her ruined future. This was written by a man named Henry Langley. "He told me to come. He promised marriage." The man's breath caught. He stepped down from the porch, his movements slow and deliberate, and took the letter from her hand. His callous thumb brushed over the familiar looping script. A shadow passed over his face, a deep and profound grief that seemed to emanate from him in waves. "This is my brother's hand," he whispered, his voice cracking on the last word. The ground seemed to tilt beneath Emily's feet. A cold dread far deeper than the shock of the robbery crawled up her spine. "Your brother?" He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the letter, as if he could will the ink to tell a different story. "Henry. He was with the cavalry. Passed through Fort Kessler last winter, got leave to come home for a few days. He mentioned he'd met someone, a governess, but he never told me her name. Never said he'd made a promise like this." Emily's voice was a fragile whisper. "We met at a bakery. We only spoke once. Then he wrote. He wrote every week for 3 months. The man finally looked up from the letter, and the sorrow in his eyes was so vast, it threatened to swallow her whole. He closed them for a moment, as if bracing himself. He's gone, ma'am." The words were blunt, unadorned by any attempt to soften the blow. "Killed outside Santa Fe. An Apache ambush. It was 3 weeks ago." The world fell away. The wind, the chirping crickets, and the scent of dust and pine, it all vanished, replaced by a roaring silence in her ears. She stumbled back a step, one hand flying to her chest, as if to hold herself together. "I'm sorry," the man said, the words rough and honest. "He never told me you were coming. If I'd known, I would have sent word." She shook her head, struggling to draw a breath that didn't feel like swallowing glass. "You are James, then. He wrote of you." "And Clara?" "Yes," he confirmed. He looked down at his daughter, who was now clinging to Emily's skirt, sensing the shift in the emotional landscape, even if she couldn't understand it. He knelt, his voice softening as he spoke to her. "Clara, why did you bring this lady here?" The little girl's lip trembled. "'Cause Mama said she'd send someone," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "A lady from far away with soft hands and kind eyes. She said we'd know her when she came, that she'd be our angel." James's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He rose and looked at Emily, and for a long, heavy moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick with shared loss, with the ghosts of a wife and a brother, with the wreckage of a life that never was. Finally, he broke it. "Clara, go inside, sweetheart. Put the kettle on." The girl obeyed, casting a worried glance back at Emily before disappearing into the house. Emily stood on the dirt path, the wind playing with loose strands of her hair, her satchel suddenly an impossible weight. "I should not have come," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the distant, unforgiving mesas. "I thought I was coming to start a new life. It seems I was only chasing a ghost." James looked down at the letter still clutched in his hand. "My brother had good instincts," he said, his voice low. "He saw something in you worth loving." "But he is not here," she replied, the finality of it a cold, hard stone in her chest. "No," James agreed. "And you weren't meant to find this waiting for you." He gestured toward the porch with a weary motion. "You're a long way from home, Miss Carter. I won't turn you out into the night. You can rest here. In the morning I'll see you get a wagon back to the rail stop." Emily could only nod, her voice a whisper lost on the wind. "Thank you." As she stepped onto the porch, she saw Clara peeking through the window, a hopeful, heartbreaking smile on her face. Inside that quiet, grief-stricken home, a space was waiting, a void left by those they had lost. And into that space, Emily Carter had just stumbled, unaware that her arrival was not an ending, but the beginning of a battle for the very soul of this broken family and the land they called home. The morning broke with a coppery haze, the sun rising over the low hills with a reluctant, mournful light. Emily sat at the small kitchen table, a chipped ceramic mug of weak coffee warming her hands. Through the window, she watched Clara chasing a grasshopper near the woodpile. Her childish laughter, a fragile, beautiful sound in the heavy silence of the homestead. James had been gone since before dawn, his presence a void in the house, the sounds of his labor, the rhythmic thud of an axe, the low murmur to a horse drifting in on the morning breeze. He worked without a word, a man moving through a world defined by duty and loss. The house itself seemed to breathe grief. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something intangibly sad. Mismatched frames on the wall held faded photographs. In the most prominent one, a young woman with kind eyes and soft brown hair smiled with a tenderness that made Emily's heart ache. "Was that your mother?" Emily asked softly as Clara came inside, her cheeks flushed. Clara nodded, her expression turning solemn. "Mama used to sing." The house felt warmer then. When Papa came in from the fields, her voice would meet him at the door. She paused, tracing the pattern on the oilcloth. After she got sick, she stopped singing. Then Papa... He stopped talking so much. Emily reached across the table and gently tucked a stray curl behind the girl's ear. I am sure she had a beautiful voice. Later that morning, Emily walked the 2 miles into Dawson's Crossing. The town was little more than a single dusty street, a collection of tired wooden buildings baking under the relentless sun. Her first stop was the sheriff's office to report the theft of her locket. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was a roadmap of weary cynicism, listened patiently, took her statement, but offered little hope. "The gang that hit that train, ma'am, they're professionals. They melt back into the territory like ghosts," he said, leaning back in his creaking chair. "The locket's likely already been traded for a bottle of whiskey in some cantina 100 miles from here. I'm sorry for your loss." Her second stop was the general store, a cluttered, comforting space that smelled of coffee beans, cured meats, and calico. Mrs. Elkins, the shopkeeper, a plump woman with shrewd, kind eyes, recognized her immediately. "You must be the girl Henry wrote to," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper as she weighed out a bag of flour. Emily blinked, surprised. "You knew about me?" "Honey, this whole town did." Mrs. Elkins chuckled, tying the bag with a deft twist of her wrist. Henry was so proud of those letters. Stopped in here for stationery every other week. Said he'd finally found someone who could see the poetry in a sunset. "Made the world feel a little less heavy," he said. Emily's heart clenched. Then, "Why did no one say anything when I arrived at the station?" Mrs. Elkins's smile faded. She hesitated, polishing an already clean countertop with her apron. "Well, we all heard about Henry, of course. A tragedy. When you showed up yesterday looking like a bride without a groom, folks just didn't know what to say. It felt cruel to be the one to break your heart on that platform." Another woman, browsing a barrel of pickles, chimed in, her tone not unkind, but laced with pity. "A jilted bride and a grieving widower under one roof. That's a sad story waiting to happen." A man leaning by the door snorted into his mustache. "Langley's got enough ghosts. Last thing he needs is another one." That's not a match. It's a slow fall into misery for the both of them. Emily left the store with her jaw tight, the town's pity stinging more than their silence. She walked the dusty road back to the ranch, her fists clenched, her earlier resolve hardening into a brittle shell. She had not come here to be an object of gossip, a sad story told over pickle barrels. She found James repairing a fence post near the cattle pen, and the rhythmic strike of his hammer a steady beat against the quiet of the afternoon. "I will be leaving on the morning train," she announced, her voice level and clear. He paused, lowering the hammer, and wiped a line of sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. He nodded, once his expression unreadable. "Figured you would." There was no surprise in his voice, just a quiet acceptance that cut deeper than any argument could have. She turned to go, but something made her stop. She looked at him, truly looked at the solid set of his shoulders, as the weariness in his eyes, the silent strength that held this fractured world together. "You are not an unkind man, James Langley." She said the words coming out stronger than she intended. "But you are as closed as a locked church on a Monday. I do not know what your wife meant to you or how much you grieve for Henry, but that little girl in there. Clara still believes in angels, and this house needs more than silence to heal. It needs a voice. James didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He just stared out toward the distant hills where the wind swept over the tall grass like a hand stroking a memory. That evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, Emily sat on the porch steps, her packed satchel beside her, like a silent testament to her departure. The air grew cool, and the vast star-dusted sky felt lonely. Clara crept out of the house and climbed into her lap, her small body warm and trusting. "Where will you go?" the little girl asked, her voice a small whisper against the chirping of the crickets. "Back east, I suppose," Emily said, stroking her hair. "To my sister. I can help her with her children. I can be useful there." Clara was silent for a moment, her head resting against Emily's chest. Then she whispered, "Mama said when the angel came, she would stay, to make us whole again." Emily's throat constricted. She looked down into the child's searching hazel eyes. "Oh, Clara, I'm not an angel. I'm just a woman who took the wrong train. Please don't go," Clara whispered, her small arms tightening around Emily's neck. "I know Papa doesn't talk much, but he listens when you read. And you smile when you look at him, even when you try not to." Emily closed her eyes, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling like sun-baked earth. The child's innocent observation struck a chord so deep and true it left her breathless. A tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "Please," Clara's voice cracked with a sob she was trying to hold back. "Don't leave us." Emily wrapped her arms around the trembling girl, burying her face in her soft curls. "All right," she heard herself say the words, a surrender and a promise. "All right, sweetheart. I will stay." One more day. Inside the house, standing just out of sight behind the half-closed door, James leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the doorframe. He had heard it all. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since he had buried his wife, he let the tears come. The days that followed unfolded with the slow, tentative grace of a spring thaw after a long, hard winter. Emily stayed. One more day became one more week. She told herself it was for Clara, who now shadowed her every move, her small hand perpetually slipped into hers. But if she was honest, it was also for the quiet, watchful man who never asked her to stay, but who never asked her to leave either. A new rhythm established itself on the ranch. Emily rose with the sun feeding the chickens, while Clara giggled and scattered grain. She learned the heft of a water bucket, the ache in muscles she never knew she had, and the simple satisfaction of a well-scrubbed floor. In the evenings, she mended James's work shirts by lamplight, her needle gliding through worn flannel as he sat by the fire, whittling small figures for Clara from scraps of wood. His face in the firelight was less hard, the lines of grief softened by the flickering shadows. He remained a man of few words, but his silence was no longer a wall. It had become a space they could share. She began to learn his language, the language of gesture. An extra quilt appeared at the foot of her cot on a cold night. A pail of fresh, warm milk was waiting on the porch for her one morning. A loose board on the porch step that had tripped her was quietly fixed before she woke the next day. He never mentioned these things. He asked nothing of her past, and she offered nothing of her own. But in the steady shared work of keeping the ranch alive, a fragile trust began to grow between them, as quiet and persistent as the wild grass pushing up through the hard-packed earth. One afternoon, a thunderhead rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised, ominous gray. The wind picked up, howling through the eaves and rattling the windows. Emily was in the small vegetable garden trying to gather the last of the ripe tomatoes before the storm broke. The first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to fall. Emily, James's voice cut through the rising wind. He was running from the barn, his expression urgent. "Get inside. This isn't a spring shower. She grabbed her basket and ran for the house, but the heavens opened up before she could reach the porch. The rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, instantly soaking her thin dress and plastering her hair to her skin. The world became a maelstrom of gray water and roaring wind. A sudden, violent gust caught her off balance. Her foot slipped in the newly formed mud, and she went down hard, the basket of tomatoes scattering around her. She tried to get up, but the mud was slick and treacherous. She was shivering, blinded by the rain and her own hair. Suddenly, strong hands were on her arms, lifting her. It was James. He had wrapped his oilskin coat around her shoulders, shielding her from the worst of the deluge. "Come on," he shouted over the storm's fury. "Let's get you inside." He half-carried, half-dragged her onto the porch and through the door, slamming it shut against the raging storm. Clara ran to them, her eyes wide with fear. "It's all right, little bird," James said, his voice softer now. "We're safe." Emily stood dripping and trembling in the middle of the kitchen mud, caked on her dress and arms. She had never felt so foolish, so utterly out of her element. James lit a lamp, casting a warm golden glow through the storm-darkened room. He handed her a rough, clean towel. "Get out of those wet things before you catch your death," he said gruffly, turning his back to give her privacy while he stoked the fire in the hearth. She changed behind a privacy screen into a borrowed nightdress, her fingers numb with cold. When she emerged wrapped in a thick wool blanket, a steaming mug of coffee was waiting for her on the table. James sat opposite her, watching the fire, his own clothes damp. "Thank you," she said quietly. He just nodded. They sat in silence, listening to the rain hammer against the roof and the wind shriek outside. The storm was a wild, violent thing, but inside the small house, with the fire crackling and the warm lamplight pushing back the shadows, it felt safe. It felt like a sanctuary. "My brother James," said suddenly, his voice low, his gaze still fixed on the flames. "He always said you could judge a person's character by how they weathered a storm." Emily looked at him, at his strong, quiet profile outlined by the fire. He was not a man of poetry or grand pronouncements. He was a man of the earth of fences and fields and seasons. And in that moment, she realized that his silence was not emptiness. It was depth. "I fell in the mud," she said with a small self-deprecating smile. "I don't think I weathered it very gracefully." He turned his head and looked at her then, and a smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a small, rare thing, but it transformed his entire face, chasing away the shadows. "You didn't run from it," he said. "You just got back up." Something unspoken passed between them, and that look a flicker of understanding, of mutual respect. It was more intimate than any touch, more profound than any spoken word. The storm raged outside, but inside the small, warm kitchen, something had broken open, clearing the air between them. The morning after the storm, a cloud of dust rose on the road, leading to the ranch. Emily, mending a tear in one of Clara's dresses on the porch, shielded her eyes. A fine black buggy approached, pulled by two high-stepping horses that were far too elegant for this rugged country. At the reins sat a man in a charcoal coat and a felt hat tipped low. He looked slick, prosperous, and utterly out of place. He pulled the buggy to a stop just outside the fence. James emerged from the battered barn, a hammer in his hand, his movements wary. He watched as the man dismounted with a confident flourish, brushing imagined dust from his lapels. "Langley," the man called out, his voice smooth and resonant. James walked slowly to the fence, not opening the gate. He wiped his hands on a rag, his shoulders squared, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Emily saw the tension in him, a coiling stillness that was more menacing than any outward display of anger. "Collins," James said flatly. The name hung in the air like something soured. "James," the man replied, a smile playing on his lips that did not reach his cold gray eyes. "Still clinging to this pile of dirt and termites, I see. I thought a man of your recent misfortunes might have developed a more practical outlook." Emily bristled at the condescending tone. James didn't flinch. "I've got nothing to sell you, Collins. Not today, not ever." James set his voice low and tight. Collins chuckled a dry, unpleasant sound. "Come now. Your wife is gone. Your brother too? The town talks, James. They say you're drowning in grief. I'm offering you a lifeline, a chance to walk away with something in your pocket before you lose this place too." He gestured expansively at the ranch. "The stagecoach route is shifting west. The territorial government is planning a new pass right through this valley. They'll come calling eventually, and their offer will be pennies on the dollar. My offer is generous. This land isn't for sale," James repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more weight than a shout. Collins's smile hardened into a sneer. He took a step closer to the fence, his voice laced with venom. "You couldn't protect them, could you, James? You were always too cautious, too slow to act. What makes you think you can protect this land from a man like me?" The insult was clearly more than just a jab about the land. It was deeply, cruelly personal. Emily inhaled sharply, instinctively, wanting to step forward. But James lifted his hand a fraction of an inch, a subtle but clear signal for her to stay back. "My wife died in my arms, right here on this porch," James said, his voice quiet, yet each word was a hammer blow. "I buried her myself under that cottonwood tree. My brother died defending this territory from men who take what isn't theirs. I have bled for this land. I have prayed on it. And I have worked it every single day since. This place isn't just dirt and termites, Collins. It remembers the hands that built it." For a moment, even Collins seemed taken aback by the raw conviction in James's voice. Then his gaze slid past James and settled on Emily. A cruel, knowing smirk spread across his face. "Ah, and this must be the replacement," he purred. "The mail-order bride left out to dry. How poetic. One brother's cast-off becomes another's housekeeper. Tell me, my dear, does he pay you in sympathy?" Emily stood up, her sewing forgotten in her lap. She walked to the edge of the porch, her chin held high, her eyes meeting Collins without a trace of fear. "I was not ordered, Mr. Collins," she said, her voice even and cold as riverstone. "And I am not a piece of anything to be picked up. My circumstances do not define my character. Yours, however, are becoming increasingly clear." Something in her articulate, icy tone made Collins' smile falter. He was used to dealing with uneducated ranchers and timid women. He was not prepared for her composure. "I suggest you leave," she finished. Collins stared at her for a long moment, then laughed, though it lacked any real humor. He tipped his hat in a mocking gesture, a feisty one. "You'll learn, James. They all do. This land has a way of breaking spirits." He climbed back into his buggy, gathering the reins. "My offer stands. But not for long. Progress is coming to this valley. You can either be the man who sold the ticket or the one who gets run over by the train." As the buggy disappeared in a trail of dust, Emily looked at James. He was staring after Collins, but his eyes were not angry. They were haunted. The mask had slipped just enough for her to see the deep, aching pain beneath. She stepped off the porch and stood beside him at the fence. "He was wrong," she said softly. "You are not a weak man, James." He finally looked at her, and the vulnerability in his gaze was a punch to the gut. "I'm just so damn tired of losing," he whispered. In that moment, she saw all of him. Not just the quiet rancher or the grieving widower, but the man who was still standing after everything and everyone he loved had been torn away. Her heart swelled not with pity, but with a fierce, powerful admiration. This was not a man who was broken. This was a man still fighting. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she would be damned if she let him fight alone. A few nights later, Emily was tidying the kitchen when she found it. Tucked away in the back of a drawer beneath a stack of old almanacs was a tarnished silver frame. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the intricate floral pattern. Inside was a photograph, faded and creased. It showed two young men standing side by side, their arms slung around each other's shoulders in a gesture of easy camaraderie. They were smiling, their faces full of the careless optimism of youth. One was a younger, smoother-faced James. The other, she realized with a jolt, was a young, handsome Marcus Collins. Between them stood a beautiful, dark-haired woman, the same woman from the portrait on the wall, James's wife, Sarah. The corner of the photograph had been torn away, a ragged edge, where perhaps someone else had once stood. A child, another woman. Emily stared at the image, her mind racing. James and Collins were not just rivals. They had been friends, brothers even. What could have happened to turn that friendship into such bitter, toxic hatred? The whispers she'd heard in town about an old tragedy suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. Before she could process the discovery, a commotion from the yard shattered the night's calm. The cattle were lowing nervously, and one of the horses let out a panicked whinny. James was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the rifle he kept mounted over the hearth. "Stay inside with Clara," he ordered, his voice grim. "Bar the door behind me." Emily did as she was told, her heart pounding. She rushed to Clara's room, finding the little girl sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "It's all right, sweetheart," Emily soothed, though her own hands were trembling. "Papa's just checking on the animals." From the window, she saw James moving cautiously toward the corral, the rifle held at the ready. A shadow detached itself from the side of the barn. Then another. Two men, their faces hidden by the darkness, rushed him. Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The fight was a chaotic blur of motion. James was strong, but he was outnumbered. He swung the butt of his rifle, connecting with one man's shoulder, but the other tackled him from behind. They went down in a tangle of limbs. Emily could hear the sickening thud of fists, the grunts of exertion and pain. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand here while he was being beaten. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on the heavy iron poker resting by the hearth. Without a second thought, she grabbed it, unbarred the door, and ran out into the night. "Get away from him," she screamed, her voice raw with a fury she didn't know she possessed. One of the men looked up, startled by her sudden appearance. That momentary distraction was all James needed. He drove his elbow back into the ribs of the man holding him and scrambled to his feet. Emily didn't hesitate. She swung the heavy poker with all her might, striking the second man across his back. He howled in pain and stumbled away. The first man, seeing his advantage lost, turned and fled into the darkness. His partner quickly followed, disappearing into the night. James stood panting, leaning against the corral fence. There was a cut on his cheek, and his lip was bleeding. He looked at Emily, who stood with the poker still clutched in her hands, her chest heaving. He stared at her, then at the poker, and then back at her. A slow, incredulous look spread across his face, a mixture of shock, awe, and something else she couldn't quite name. "You came out here with a fire poker?" he asked, his voice raspy. "They were hurting you," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious explanation in the world. He pushed himself off the fence and walked toward her, closing the space between them, until he was standing just inches away. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching the cut on his cheek, and then he looked at her again. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the two of them standing in a pool of moonlight in the quiet yard. The air crackled with unspoken emotions. "No one," he said, his voice thick with a feeling that went far beyond gratitude, "has ever fought for me like that." He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat of him, see the raw emotion churning in his hazel eyes. It was a moment of pure, unvarnished connection. They were no longer a grieving rancher and a misplaced governess. They were two people who had stood together against the darkness. Two people who had, without realizing it, started to become a fortress for each other. He took a half-step closer, and she thought for one wild, breathless second that he was going to kiss her. But the moment was broken by a small voice from the porch. "Papa, Emily." Clara stood in the doorway, a frightened silhouette against the lamplight. James flinched back, as if burned the mask of the stoic widower slamming back into place. The spell was broken. "It's all right, Clarabelle." He called out, his voice strained. "Just a couple of coyotes spooking the horses. Go on back to bed." He turned and walked back toward the house without another word to Emily, leaving her standing alone in the moonlight, the heavy iron poker suddenly feeling cold and foreign in her hands. She had confronted him with a ghost from his past without saying a word, and in return, he had shown her a glimpse of the man he was, before retreating back into the safety of his silence. The battle lines were being drawn not just with Collins, but within the walls of their own hearts. The sabotage grew more insidious. A section of fence was cut, allowing a dozen head of cattle to wander off into the canyons, costing James 2 full days of hard riding to recover them. The rope for the well bucket was found, frayed, nearly snapped through. Each incident was small, deniable, but together they formed a campaign of psychological warfare, designed to wear James down, to make him feel unsafe in his own home. The tension culminated on a hot, breathless afternoon. Emily had taken Clara down to the creek that ran along the edge of the property to cool off. They were splashing in the shallows, Clara's laughter echoing in the quiet grove of cottonwoods, when Emily saw the distinct tracks of a shod horse fresh in the mud, leading away from a thicket of willows upstream. It was a place no rancher would ride. A chill went through her that had nothing to do with the cool water. "Clara," she said, her voice tight, "I think it's time to go back to the house." As they started up the path, a low, menacing rattle stopped them in their tracks. Not 5 feet away, coiled in a patch of sunlight on the path ahead, was a large rattlesnake. It wasn't a random encounter. It was too perfectly placed, too deliberate. Someone had put it there. Someone who knew they would be coming this way. Emily's blood ran cold. She pushed Clara behind her, her body forming a shield. "Don't move, sweetheart," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Stay very, very still." The snake's tail was a blur. Its head raised, its black, beady eyes fixed on them. Time seemed to stop. The world narrowed to the space between them, and the deadly creature blocking their path to safety. From behind them, a shot exploded, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The snake's head vanished in a spray of dust and blood. Emily flinched, pulling Clara tighter against her, as the snake's body writhed in its death throes. James stood on the ridge above them, his rifle still smoking. His face was a thundercloud of fury and terror. He scrambled down the embankment, his long strides eating up the ground. He didn't stop until he reached them, his eyes scanning them both frantically, checking for injury. "Are you all right?" he demanded, his voice rough with fear. Emily could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He knelt and swept a sobbing Clara into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, murmuring words of comfort into her hair. When he looked up at Emily, the fear in his eyes had been replaced by something else, something cold and hard and absolute. It was the look of a man who had been pushed past his limit. That night, after Clara was safely asleep, James paced the small kitchen like a caged animal. The last vestiges of his quiet resignation had been burned away, leaving behind a white-hot rage. "This is my fault," he said, slamming his fist on the table, making the lamp jump. "I've been waiting, reacting, trying to hold on. I should have gone after him the moment he showed his face." "What could you have done?" Emily asked softly. "He's careful. There's no proof." "Proof," he shot back, his voice raw. "He put a snake on the path that my daughter walks. My daughter. That's all the proof I need." He finally stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes blazing. "This ends. Tonight." He turned and strode toward the door. "Where are you going?" she cried, grabbing his arm. To see Collins. To end this one way or another. James, no. That's what he wants. He wants to provoke you into doing something rash, something Sheriff Brody can't ignore. I don't care anymore. I do, she insisted, her grip tightening on his arm. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path to the door. Think of Clara. What happens to her if you're in jail, or worse? You can't let him win by turning you into him. He stared down at her. His jaw clenched, his whole body trembling with suppressed violence. For a long moment, she thought he would push past her. But then he looked at her face, at the desperate plea in her eyes, and the fury began to recede, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. He slumped against the door from the fight draining out of him. Then what do we do, Emily? He whispered, his voice broken. How do we fight a man who won't play by any rules? She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the old faded photograph of him and Collins. She held it up between them. We start with the truth, she said. Tell me what happened. Tell me why he hates you this much. This isn't about land, James. It never has been. This is about her, isn't it, your wife? James stared at the photograph, at the smiling faces of the two young men who had once been friends. He closed his eyes, a pained expression crossing his features. The dam of his silence, which had held back years of grief and guilt, finally began to crack. It's about all of them, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah, and his wife, and his son. He opened his eyes, and the look he gave her was filled with a sorrow so deep it was bottomless. It's about the day I let them all die. The wind began to howl just after sunset, a low, mournful moan that built into a raging shriek. It came from the west, carrying with it a wall of red dust that blotted out the stars and turned the sky the color of dried blood. A sandstorm. It descended on the ranch with a blinding, choking fury, reducing visibility to mere feet and scourging the land with grit that felt like fine glass. Inside the small house, lamps were lit, and rags were stuffed under the doors to keep out the worst of the dust. James stood by the window, peering into the swirling chaos, his rifle in his hand. He'll use this storm as cover, he said, his voice grim. He'll think we're blind, then we won't be. Emily replied, her voice steady. She stood beside him, Henry's old Colt .45, held firmly in her hands. Clara was asleep in her room, a damp cloth over her face to help her breathe. They were in this together. There was no more running. The first sign was the horses. They screamed from the barn, a sound of pure terror that cut through the howl of the wind. Then a faint orange glow flickered against the red haze. The barn, James growled. He's trying to burn us out. He moved for the door, but Emily caught his arm. Wait, it could be a trap to draw you out. As if on cue, a window on the far side of the house shattered inward. A flaming torch wrapped in oil-soaked rags landed on the floorboards, instantly igniting a braided rug. The fight was not outside. It was here. James didn't hesitate. He stamped out the flames with his boots, while Emily aimed the Colt at the broken window. A figure appeared in the swirling dust outside, leveling a shotgun. She fired. The recoil slammed her shoulder, but her shot went true, hitting the wood frame next to the man's head. He ducked back with a curse. They're coming from all sides, James yelled over the roar of the wind and the crackling of the distant fire. Another window broke. Then another. The house was under siege. Through the haze, Emily saw him. Marcus Collins, striding through the storm like a vengeful god, a torch in one hand and a pistol in the other. He wasn't sending his men to do the work this time. This was personal. He kicked open the front door, which had been weakened by the wind. Dust and grit billowed into the room, extinguishing one of the lamps. He stood there, his fine coat whipped by the wind, his face a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. James. He bellowed, his voice carrying over the storm. Time to pay your debt. He fired his pistol into the ceiling. James shoved Emily behind him, returning fire with his rifle. The room filled with smoke and the deafening roar of gunfire. Splinters flew from the walls. Collins ducked behind the doorframe, using it for cover. "You think this is about land?" Collins screamed, his voice strained with madness. "This has always been about them, about Sarah and my boy. The day of the mine collapse. You remember that day, James?" "It was an accident," Marcus James shouted back, reloading his rifle with trembling hands. "An accident." Collins laughed, a horrifying broken sound. "You call your cowardice an accident?" The timbers were groaning. The foreman said to get out, but you hesitated. You wanted to double-check the supports, you said. You always were the cautious one. Too cautious. He lunged from behind the doorframe, firing wildly. James tackled him, and the two men went down, rolling on the floor in a desperate, brutal struggle. The torch flew from Collins' hand, landing near a pile of curtains. Flames erupted, licking up the dry fabric. My wife and son were coming to bring us lunch. Collins shrieked, his face inches from James's. They were at the mouth of the tunnel when it came down. If you had made the call 5 minutes sooner, they would be alive. But you waited. You stood there and you let them die. Emily, choking on the smoke, saw the pistol skitter across the floor. She scrambled for it. As her fingers closed around the grip, Collins delivered the final devastating blow, and your brother knew it. He spat, landing a punch on James's jaw. Henry was there. He saw you freeze. He told me himself. He begged you to give the order. He felt so guilty, he couldn't even look you in the eye. Emily froze. Henry. Her Henry, the man whose poetic words had drawn her across a continent. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was a part of this tragedy. That's why he wrote to your little mail-order bride, Collins, raged, his voice cracking with a grief that had festered into poison. He was trying to bring something good back into this family, to atone for his sin. He was coming home to confess, James, to tell you he was as much to blame as you were. The revelation hit Emily with the force of a physical blow. Her idealized memory of Henry shattered. He wasn't a perfect hero. He was a flawed, guilty man, trying to heal a wound he had helped create. Her journey here hadn't been about a simple love story. It had been about redemption. James roared a sound of pure anguish and threw Collins off him. He rose to his feet, his face a bloody, grief-stricken mess. The fire was spreading, smoke filling the room. Through the haze, Collins raised his pistol, aiming it straight at James's heart. Emily didn't think. She acted. She lifted the Colt with both hands, took aim at the man who was destroying everything, and fired. The shot was deafening. Collins cried out, clutching his shoulder, as his pistol clattered to the floor. He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief, before sinking to his knees. The fight was over. The storm raged on outside, but inside the burning house, a terrible silence fell. James stared at Collins, then at Emily, his expression a chaotic mix of grief, relief, and dawning realization. She had made her choice. She had not chosen the ghost of the man she came to marry. She had chosen the living, breathing, broken man standing in front of her. She had chosen her home. The sandstorm blew itself out by dawn, leaving behind a world scoured clean and unnaturally quiet. The sky was a pale, fragile blue. The Langley Ranch was a scene of devastation. The barn was a smoking skeleton of charred timbers. The house, though still standing, bore the deep scars of the fight-broken windows, scorched walls, and a gaping blackened hole where the fire had burned through the roof. Sheriff Brody and his deputies had arrived after the worst was over, drawn by the glow of the fire once the dust had settled. They found Marcus Collins slumped against a wall, bleeding from the gunshot wound to his shoulder, his hateful rantings finally silenced by pain and defeat. He and his 2 surviving men were taken into custody without a fight. The reign of terror was over. In the quiet aftermath, as the townspeople began to arrive with buckets of water and offers of help, James and Emily stood together in the yard watching the sun rise. They were covered in soot, bruised and exhausted, but they were alive. Clara, who had slept through the worst of the chaos in her small protected room, ran out and threw her arms around James's legs. He lifted her up, holding her, as if she were the most precious thing in the world, his face buried in her hair. Later that day, after the last of the embers had been doused and the neighbors had departed with promises to return with lumber and tools, James and Emily sat on the edge of the porch, the one section that remained untouched. The silence between them was no longer one of grief or uncertainty. It was a space of healing. James finally turned to her, his face etched with exhaustion. "He was right," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "About Henry, about me." He told her the whole story then. He and Marcus Collins had been partners buying the old silver mine with dreams of striking it rich. James was the cautious geologist, Collins the ambitious businessman. On that fateful day, James had seen signs of instability in the main shaft and had called for a halt, insisting on a safety inspection. Collins, eager to meet a deadline, had accused him of being timid. They argued. Henry, young and impressionable, had sided with Collins. James, unwilling to risk his men's lives, had stood his ground. He hesitated, double-checking his readings, trying to convince them. And in those few minutes of hesitation, the world had ended. A deep tremor, a groan of stressed timbers, and then the collapse. Sarah, his wife, had been at the mouth of the tunnel with Collins' wife and young son bringing their lunch. They were buried instantly. "I didn't freeze," James whispered, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "I was being careful. But my caution cost them everything." Marcus saw it as cowardice. Henry saw it as a shared failure. And I've spent every day since wondering if they were right. Emily listened, her heart aching for the impossible weight he had carried alone for so long. When he was finished, she reached out and took his calloused, soot-stained hand in hers. "You made the only choice you could with the knowledge you had," she said softly. "You chose to protect your men. That wasn't cowardice, James. It was leadership. The tragedy isn't what you did. It's what you all lost." She squeezed his hand. "Henry's letters. I understand them now. He wasn't just offering me a new life. He was trying to give one to you and to Clara. He was trying to bring an angel into this house because he felt like a devil." James looked at their joined hands, then up at her face. He saw no judgment in her eyes, only compassion and a profound understanding. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "He sent you here to heal us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I almost let my pride and my grief send you away." "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. "This is my home now, if you'll have me." He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles. "I'll have you," he said, "for as long as you'll stay." The church was little more than a one-room frame building with a crooked bell and windows that let the wind sing through the cracks. But on a sun-drenched Saturday morning, 6 weeks later, it was filled with a light so pure and golden, it felt sacred. Wildflowers gathered by Clara from the meadows sat in mason jars along the aisle, and the simple wooden pews were filled with the people of Dawson's Crossing. Mrs. Elkins was there, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Sheriff Brody stood in the back, his hat held respectfully over his chest. They had come not to witness the union of two broken strangers, but to celebrate the forging of a family they had all watched rise from the ashes. At the front of the room stood James. He wore his best shirt, and the bruises from the fight had long since faded. The weary, haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a calm, steady hope. Beside him, Clara stood in a pale blue dress, her cheeks rosy with health, clutching a small bouquet and beaming with an incandescent joy. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and Emily stepped inside. Her dress was simple cream linen sewn by her own hands, but the radiant smile on her face was more beautiful than any silk or lace. She walked down the aisle, her steps sure and even. Her eyes were fixed only on James. When she reached him, he took her hand, his touch warm and firm. The preacher's words were simple and heartfelt, echoing the quiet, sturdy love that had grown between the couple before him. When asked if she would take this man to be her husband, Emily looked into James's hazel eyes and said with a voice clear and strong, "With all of my heart." And when James was asked if he would take her as his wife, his voice was thick with emotion as he replied, "Forever." Clara stepped forward and placed a small, plain silver ring, once her mother's now polished bright, into his hand. As he slipped it onto Emily's finger, it was not an act of replacement, but one of continuation. It was a promise to honor the past while building a new future. The kiss they shared was gentle and deep, a silent vow that sealed not the end of a courtship, but the true beginning of their life. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the prairie in shades of lavender and gold, James took Emily's hand. He led her not to the newly rebuilt house, but to the lone cottonwood tree that stood on a small rise overlooking the valley. Beneath it were two simple wooden crosses, one for his brother Henry and one for his first wife Sarah. He knelt and placed a single bright yellow wildflower on Sarah's grave. He stayed there for a moment, his head bowed in a silent communion of memory and farewell. When he stood, he turned to Emily, his expression serene. "She would have liked you," he said simply. "She would have loved the way you made Clara laugh again." It was the most beautiful eulogy and the most profound acceptance he could have given. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object that glinted in the fading light. It was her mother's silver locket. Emily gasped, her hands flying to her throat. "How?" "Sheriff Brody found it on one of Colin's men," James explained, his thumb gently polishing the smooth surface. "He gave it to me this morning. He said it belonged with family." He opened the locket. The tiny portraits of her parents were still nestled safely inside. Then, with the utmost care, he fastened the mended chain around her neck. The cool silver felt like a benediction against her skin. It was no longer just a link to her past, but a symbol of a future that had been lost and then miraculously found. It was a testament to the fact that here in this wild and unforgiving land, she had not been broken. She had been made whole. He drew her into his arms, and they stood together under the vast star-dusted sky, watching the lights from their home begin to twinkle in the valley below. The house was no longer a coffin filled with silence and ghosts. It was a beacon. The wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves, but it was not a lonely sound. It sounded like a promise.